in a way, I couldn't believe that the story hadn't been told. And yeah, as you say, the rabbit hole opened up and I fell right into it.
Welcome to The Endgame by Clear Estate, life's final chapter discussed openly. I'm Davide Pisanu, CEO of Clear Estate. In these conversations, we get real about estates, legacies, and our efforts to disrupt old systems with new technology. My co-host, Sarah, what we're going to call her, like the estate diva, the estate something. I don't know. We have a little contest internally about what we're going to call her. But anyway, Sarah's amazing. So she is our resident expert, but she's on vacation. So that's okay. She'll come back in a couple of weeks. Today, complex legacies through the story of Dr. Penfield. I mean, I live very close in Montreal to a street called Dr. Penfield. And so we are reminded every day of the importance of Mr. Penfield's, Dr. Penfield's impact on our lives. And most of us of a certain age, I mean, most of us listening to this podcast are of a certain age, but most of us of a certain age remember the Heritage Minute and the burnt toast. And I invite all of you to go YouTube it, burnt toast, Heritage Minute, Dr. Penfield, and that claim at the end of greatest Canadian alive or something like that. Clearly, big impact. Somebody that had a huge legacy. But today we're going to talk about a little bit of the controversies, the personal drama, and we're going to talk to Eric Andrew Gee, like the author of Mind Mappers, Friendship, Betrayal, and the Obsessive Quest to Chart the Brain. It was a fantastic conversation, by the way, so it was amazing. You're talking about this very intelligent, mindful, inquisitive person that spent years just digging through archives and thinking through the complex persona of Dr. Penfield, but also the complexity of the relationship of Dr. Penfield with his colleague, Dr. William Cohn. And, on this podcast, we think about legacies and we think about what do we leave behind. And we think about, regrets, and we think about what we should have done and maybe not done, and how do we shape our future, and how is our story told, and how do we shape the way our story is going to be told. This was an amazing conversation around how important, clearly Dr. Penfield is an important person. So how important people with impact, and also Mr. Cohn, correct, Dr. Cohn, how can we shape the way the narrative is told? How can we shape the way our legacy survives us? And how can we fail as well in certain ways? And that's fine, correct? Like, I mean, failing is okay because we're not around anymore. But it's something to be thought about. And I think about that conversation almost on a daily basis when I cross Dr. Penfield the street while I'm driving my wife to work and driving myself to work. So really interesting, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Please don't forget to subscribe to The Endgame by Clear Estate on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Journalist Eric Andrew Gee is the Quebec correspondent for the Globe and Mail newspaper, formerly a reporter for the Toronto Star with bylines in magazines like The Walrus and The New Republic. An award-winning writer, I think top 25 under 25 journalist prize winner. Did you remember that one, Eric?
Yeah, that was exactly 10 years ago. So yeah.
His first book, published by Penguin Random House, is called The Mind Mappers, Friendship, Betrayal, and the Obsessive Quest to Chart the Brain. Eric, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So casting new light on a Canadian hero is certainly a choice for one's first book. We're all about challenging the status quo here. But what about Dr. Penfield's legacy piqued your interest and curiosity?
hmm In a way, it wasn't, my goal wasn't to take Penfield down a peg. in any way. I became interested in his work in a very roundabout way. I've been researching the addictiveness of smartphones, of all things, and came across this pioneering study that happened in Montreal in the 1950s involving a rat and an electrode. The rat became addicted to tapping the lever that stimulated the electrode. This is the pleasure center of the brain. And this happened in close collaboration with Penfield. It was still being discussed 60 years later, so I filed it away and thought this could be interesting to delve into one day when I have a little breathing room. I was still working in the Toronto newsroom of the Globe at the time, but I was soon after that hired in the Montreal bureau and thought here's a great chance to pursue this a little further, find out about this relatively obscure Canadian contribution to, this massive, field, the study of the human brain. And my earliest reading into it, of course, I knew the name Penfield. There's the famous
There's a
Heritage
street.
Minute, Doctor, Doctor, I smell burnt toast. That's how I explained what I was working on to everyone at dinner parties for the last 5 years. But what really piqued my interest was coming across the name and the sort of faint outline of the story of a man named William Cohn, who, in the one sort of chapter in the one book that really treated his career, it became clear this was Penfield's closest friend, his deputy for 30 years, and his equal as a surgeon and as a contributor to the Montreal Neurological Institute, the Center for Brain Research that they co-founded in 1934 and that became, in short order, really the world's uh, main hub, its most important hub for brain research. And when I say the world, it's not an exaggeration. In the 1950s, it was, the case has been made that it was the site of the foundation of modern neuroscience. Penfield and Cohn recruited a team of brilliant scientists in different disciplines, but under one roof, and really pioneered the treatment of epilepsy, and as my book title alludes to, map the functional areas of the brain. This is where memory resides. This is where pleasure and fear can be triggered. This is where the motor functions of the body are centered in the brain. And Penfield, insofar as this Canadian kind of contribution is known, all the credit accrues to Penfield. And Cohn, aside from this one chapter that I dug out of a relatively obscure, sort of coffee table book, Cohn's contribution was completely forgotten. As I quickly found out, a very kind of complex, thorny, narratively rich character. And I wanted to know more. And once I learned more, I wanted to share what I had learned and help, right the wrong of Cohn's, having been eclipsed, really by Penfield. And there's all these reasons for that we can get into, but that's how it came about. I mean, Penfield is a giant figure and someone I have complicated feelings for, but admiration is heavily mixed in there. And the project was not really necessarily about reassessing Penfield's legacy so much as adding this key figure to the portrait. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the book does end up being a reassessment of Penfield's legacy, um, but it's not a takedown, and it's more a project of building back up Cone. So yeah, that's sort of how I came to it.
I mean, I remember those Minutes. I mean, I remembered it. I also watched it for this for this
Yeah, yeah,
conversation. But it ends with the greatest Canadian alive.
yeah.
I mean, I guess my question for you is, So first of all, why was this true, or is this
Hmm.
still true? And second is, I think one of the great conclusions from your work is, I mean, nobody's truly alone, correct? Like we're all built,
Mm.
like we all built or we build our legacy with the help of others, willingly or unwillingly. I mean, does the fact that other people participated, like, does that diminish kind of like
Yeah.
that, stature
Yeah.
or that qualifier?
Yeah, so it's a great question and really dives to the heart of the book, which is about the forgotten legacy behind Penfield in many ways. So, um, it's not to reduce Penfield, who I think really could make a good claim to be the greatest living Canadian in the mid 1950s. He had built this world-class institute of brain research. I mean, it was the best in the world. There's no question. Everyone who wanted to become a neurosurgeon from India to China through the Arab world and dozens of Americans came to Montreal to learn how the brain worked, the geography of the brain, and how to heal it. And there was really no close second. So he had also, in the process, helped find a surgical cure for epilepsy and mapped large swaths of the brain, finding out where memory resides, pleasure, uh, the motor functions, speech, etc. So a towering figure, but behind him was this man in the shadows, this almost kind of archetypal uh, man in the shadows, William Cohn, who was Penfield's best friend. His polar opposite in many ways is as awkward and shy as Penfield was outgoing and charismatic, shorter, stockier. Um, they even looked like opposites. And Penfield, to his credit, was the first uh, to acknowledge Cohn's contributions to his achievements. In his memoir, he writes about it repeatedly. It's just that there wasn't much of a receptive audience for that. People were attracted to the story of the glamorous hero, the sort of knight in shining armor, and Penfield had a weakness for that image himself. His mother had founded a private school called the Galahad School, almost exclusively for Penfield's education and to get him into the Rhodes Scholarship. So he had seen himself as a Galahad from a very young age, and simultaneously Cohn, this background figure, was almost neurotically averse to the limelight. So. We can get into that, but his legacy suffered from all these factors, and um, it was sort of subsumed into Penfield's.
They both grew up in the Midwest, correct? Like they're a brain drain, reverse brain drain product, if I understand
It's
correctly.
true. It's true. Yeah. It was unusual even then. And yeah, despite their differences in so many areas, they had remarkably similar backgrounds. They both came from a long line of doctors, these medical families, the American Midwest, turn of the 20th century, both then grow up without their fathers for different reasons. Penfield's abandons his family, and Cohn's father dies from a typhus infection. He drank from a public water fountain and caught an infection, and there was no antibiotics then. And this, these early childhood traumas drove both of them, both a need for male companionship that they found in each other, and a restless, almost relentless desire to improve the practice of medicine that had failed both of them. Penfield's father was a kind of quack doctor who um, couldn't make enough money to support the family and basically ran off. But Cohen watched helplessly as his father died from this infection that now would be cured by you know, uh, simple antibiotic. Yeah, really, you know, uh, almost uncannily similar backgrounds, and then yeah, this sort of stroke of luck for Canada that they get recruited up to Montreal.
You explain how you got into thinking about Penfield because you were thinking about, mobile phone addiction interested in the brain.
Yeah.
Um, but you really started digging into kind of like the Penfield Cone relationship and their partnership. What's that process that led you kind of down the rabbit hole,
Yeah.
in the sense of like really, really digging into it? Because you're saying that, Penfield in his memoirs talked about Cohen, but you went a lot further than that. So
Yeah.
what does that look like for you, and what were you trying to achieve?
Yeah. The little that there was publicly available about Cohn was enough to tell me that uh that he was a hero, almost a saintly figure, although terribly unhappy, and that becomes a defining feature of his life. Um, but that B, he was uh, unjustly overlooked, and that didn't sit right with me. There was something about the overlooked underdog that I just wanted to set the record straight. And my first instinct was just to write about Cohn, and I wrote a piece for the Globe and Mail just about Cohn. It was a kind of capsule biography of him and unearthing this forgotten hero. But I just wasn't done with him, and I knew there was more to learn. Um, and I also amassed like a 20,000 word uh, draft for this article that got whittled down to 3,000 words. So I just had all this material, and um, it was just so compelling to me, the interplay of these two figures, so different and yet so codependent. Um, it I think resonates with a lot of people who have partnerships, whether they're romantic or professional or platonic. There can be these subtle power imbalances between two people that, if they're left unaddressed, can have these sort of explosive consequences. And so it had this sort of novelistic quality that it's just very human and relatable. And then it just so happened that it undergirded this really important Canadian story and really important scientific story. I mean, the book has only so far been published in Canada, but I think it's globally significant. I mean, the influence of the Neuro was so far from being limited to Canada, and what was unrivaled in its influence in the middle of the 20th century. So, in a way, I couldn't believe that the story hadn't been told. Um, and yeah, as you say, the rabbit hole opened up, and fell right into it.
You're talking about that partnership. I mean, hindsight is 2020. You're looking at it from the perspective of history, and we've
Yeah.
seen the heritage minutes, and we see streets named after Dr. Penfield in town, and things like that. Do you think that they would have perceived their relationship as unfair? Or do you think that Cohen would have perceived the relationship as unfair at the time?
Yes and no. It's a great question. It's one of again, the questions at the heart of the book. Cone was the relationship was mutually beneficial for 25 years. Cone did not want the limelight. He did not want a leadership role. He was a worker bee. Uh, he elevated the status of worker bee almost to an art form in the sense that he was the most technically gifted neurosurgeon in the world. That's the consensus. He was the kindest and most humane bedside physician that his patients had ever encountered. And I've met some of them who are still with us, who were children when he treated them, and still get tears in their eyes, remembering his gentle voice and the reassuring smile and the squeezes of the hand he would give. And um, he would change bedpans and catheters himself. This is the job of an orderly or a entry-level nurse, and here was this world's greatest neurosurgeon doing it himself. So this was where he thrived, and this is where he wanted to be. He slept at the institute. He had an unhappy marriage and was rarely home. He was the purest workaholic I've ever encountered. Um, and wanted nothing to do with fame and fortune. He routinely turned down patients' fees if he thought they would have trouble affording it. He turned down newspaper profiles and magazine articles because he didn't want to be photographed. So in one sense, no, he was very happy to be Penfield's second in command, and he adored Penfield. And this is another important element of the book. They loved each other in deeply and in different ways, and both realized that they were indispensable to each other. Penfield almost didn't come to Montreal because the Royal Victoria initially refused to cover Cohn's salary. But on the other hand, Cohn turned down half a dozen brilliant job offers to stay with Penfield. So th their roles were exactly as each of them wanted them to be until this crucial hinge moment in the book that we can get to, in which Cohn felt um, unfairly treated by Penfield. And I think he was right. And I think Penfield came to realize that Cohn was right. Um, and it damages their relationship irreparably.
And what's that story?
Yeah. So Penfield has this very well-rounded life. He writes novels on the side. He loves to go sailing, unlike Magog, where he has a country place. He has four children. He wants to retire. He's a very dedicated scientist, and but he feels he's made his mark, and it's time for him to enjoy himself a little more. And everyone in their orbit assumes Cohn will take over from Penfield because he is the unquestioned number two at the Institute. He's, although unheralded, the world's greatest neurosurgeon. He has kept the place running since it was founded in 1934. And Penfield has other ideas. So he perhaps correctly decides that Cohn doesn't have the administrative leadership qualities to be director of the Institute. But rather than sitting down with his closest friend of 30 years, the godfather to his children, uh, and saying this, Bill, I don't even think you'll enjoy it. And that I think I agree with. Um, he secretly sets up a committee to select his successor, and Cohn's name isn't even on the short list. He he finds this out. Penfield announces his retirement to the Institute. Again, Cohn has not been forewarned, and Cohn starts hearing these rumors that people are getting interviewed, and he realizes he's not being considered, and he feels betrayed. Um, as much by his friend's secrecy as by being passed over for this prestigious job that he indeed may not have been well suited for. So, it's complicated because for all the reasons I've outlined, he wouldn't have been a natural director. Penfield had to do a lot of glad handing, a lot of speech writing, and he was very good at all these things, articulating his vision for the Institute, which he wanted to use, but essentially to find the soul of man in the brain. Couldn't be more ambitious. This was not Cohn's approach. So they have a bitter fight in Penfield's office. Cohn, they shut the door and have it out. We know this because there's a letter from the next day in which Penfield sort of tries to explain himself. Um, and their relationship never recovers, and neither does Cohn's mental health. Um, he'd been prone to depression throughout his adult life. Um, but i- this is too much. And yeah, he becomes, um, yeah, certainly was not diagnosed, but he was clinically depressed uh, I'm pausing because I'm considering how much to say here because the book I think in a way is it does build to this climactic moment in the story, but but it's very painful for Penfield. He realizes there's been this breach in his friendship, and he's not a very introspective person, but he knows he's badly wounded his best friend, and um, he feels sick about it. I think I'll just say what happens because it's maybe a bit silly to be evasive of. It's a matter of public record. Um, Cohn, 5 years later, after a period of prolonged depression, which he's mocked by his colleagues for looking like a moose because he walks with his head down all the time, and um, he rarely comes out of his office except at night when he operates at night to avoid people and. Um, May 4th, 1959, he takes a vial of cyanide from the laboratory at the institute and goes to his office and takes the cyanide. And Penfield and a couple of other colleagues find his body in the morning. So, um, Penfield is shaken to his core and knows um, gradually comes to realize that he's played a role, an indirect role in his friend's death, and it's really shattering for him. And it's this tragic end to the story. Um, you know, um, it's also an important part of why Cohn's legacy gets smothered because his death is shrouded in secrecy and stigma. Um, so yeah, it's really a dark coda to this really kind of glorious story. And the book is not all shadows. It's really the first 30 years of their working life together were just success after success, and they accomplished something that um, has saved thousands of lives and illuminated the darkest corners of our minds. Um, the bitter irony that I try to tease out in the book is that they were the world experts on the human brain, but couldn't understand each other's minds. And this is another contradiction in their story that attracted me to it in a way as a storyteller.
I mean, tragic. We're in 2026 today. Do you think that their greatest legacy is the Institute itself, the way that it's transcended time and is still around?
I would say in a funny way, it's not because the Institute, although it still does cutting edge work and is again like in keeping with Penfield's original vision, still a working hospital for the treatment of neurological illnesses and also this very rarefied research institute. Um, it doesn't hold the dominant place in the scientific world that it did in their heyday. And Cohn's death, I'd argue, brings the golden age of the Institute to a close, which is sort of the end of the Second World War until the beginning of the 1960s. And it took their partnership to elevate this place from a really good brain hospital to this sort of temple of science and medicine. They were also, in a way, the Institute was a victim of its own success in that it trained half the world's neurosurgeons who then went off to found their own clinics. And some of these end up rivaling the neuro. When they were starting out, neurosurgery was so much in its infancy that there just weren't that many rivals on the scene. And if you were a talented and ambitious young brain researcher or surgeon, you were going to Montreal. There just weren't that many other options. And so they became this magnet for all the world's, sort of insight and talent. Um, that just wasn't sustainable. It was never going to remain so preeminent. And so their legacy, and this is something I think they'd be glad about, although they were very devoted to the Institute and to Montreal, their legacy is spread out throughout the world. I mean, they trained the first 10 Indian neurosurgeons. Um, there were no neurosurgeons in the Indian subcontinent until the 1940s when they began coming to Montreal because of the kind of British Commonwealth connection. They trained the first Chinese neurosurgeon. They trained the first Arab neurosurgeon and the first two African American neurosurgeons. So when I say half the world's, you know, brain researchers were being trained in Montreal at the time, it's if anything, I'm underselling it. And so, that's their greatest legacy. And then the US, I mean, something like half of the fellows and residents at the Neuro were American. And virtually every city in the continent had a Cone or Penfield trained neurosurgical clinic at a certain point because it was the seedbed for everything. Um, one of their residents, David Hubble, went on to win the Nobel Prize, I think at Harvard, for figuring out the part of the brain responsible for vision. And so in a way, their legacy transcended the institute, and I think ultimately they'd be really pleased about that.
One thing I'm interested in hearing you about, I mean, you've looked through the historical record, you've kind of like built and rebuilt the story of Penfield and Cone. How do you view that process of that legacy being built? Like, who plays a role
Mm,
after in telling the story? I mean, obviously you're now part of the narrative because you're telling a different
yeah.
story. But looking at like 50, 60, 70 years of stories being written, who's actually writing the story? Like
Yeah.
who's in control of how we remember these figures and how that legacy is being shaped?
Yeah, that's so interesting to contemplate. I mean, Penfield had a lot of things working in his advantage as for building his own legacy. He wasn't shy about burnishing it himself. So to really build a legacy, you do, what do we call it now, like self-promotion or whatever. It might not have been the terminology at the time, but Penfield,
No
he
Instagram. No
yeah,
Instagram at the
yeah. He
time.
wouldn't have been on Instagram. He wasn't a shallow person, and he wasn't um obsessed by this. I mean, he was a very conscientious doctor, and this is, I'm not trying to make him seem like some, flighty prima donna who is all about the likes. But he kept every piece of paper that ever crossed his desk. He was building an archive because he knew that he would be written about. Cohn was just the opposite. He was a terrible correspondent in the first place. He could never be bothered to answer letters or to write them in the first place because he was so busy treating patients. And so my book, although it's an attempt I read every single piece of paper in the Cohn archive at McGill. Uh, didn't even come close to Penfield. It's so enormous. Um, and and yet, Penfield speaks more clearly, I think, in the book, despite my best efforts than Cohn, because his archive is that much richer. And, he wasn't trying to outshine Cohn. He was just trying to speak down through history by keeping his diaries, which at times are very revealing and intimate. He talks about his sex life with his wife and um all kinds of insecurities he had. I mean, yeah, I think to his credit that he leaves this behind for posterity. Um, it's the responsible thing to do. It's not. He wasn't wrong that he was a world historic figure and that there would be books written about him. So I'm not trying to say you, I'm forever grateful that he kept such a voluminous record. So Penfield controls the narrative for a long time. He also just outlives Cohn, and so he gets to have his say. He writes a memoir that's published, months before his death. May have been published shortly after his death. I think he finished it months before his death, but it sells quite well because, at the time, and this is also a media story. Now, this was the golden age of print, and frankly, television media when there was just money splashing around and there's probably not a single famous surgeon in Canada today, but Penfield was genuinely famous. There's just every magazine in the country, of which there were many more, wrote profiles of him. Most of the big ones in the US did too, Time and the Saturday Evening Post. And so it was Maclean's that dubbed him the greatest living Canadian, which was just hugely influential at the time, mass circulation, weekly magazine. Um, One of his patrons, J.W. McConnell, who helped, he was a tycoon and hands in many pots, helped build the Nero with his donations. He owned the Montreal Star, and the Star had a reporter who went to the Nero every day to see if there's anything newsworthy there and help publicize some of its biggest, scientific breakthroughs. So, there were journalists hungry for copy back then in a way that, we're a dwindling breed, sadly. Um, that's part of it. Penfield also has a bigger family than Cohn, and they burnish his legend. So Cohn doesn't have any children. His one surviving brother has children, but they live in Iowa, so they're sort of not in the mix. Penfield has this big family, four kids, 15 grandchildren, I think, and he's the great paterfamilias. He is, to his credit, a big, great family man, and they're very devoted to him. So his grandson, this documentary filmmaker named Jefferson Lewis, writes a really quite good biography of Penfield. A few years after he dies, and he has exclusive access to his journals and so on at the time. They're now publicly available. But his family similarly, helped me in my research and helped see the world through Penfield's eyes. So he has all these advantages for building a legacy. He has the media in his corner. He has himself he's very articulate is the other thing. Cohn wasn't a wordsmith. He was a kind of mechanically minded person, and Penfield could write quite beautifully and certainly liked to talk and write. And so he was just, the odds were always stacked in his favor for building his legacy. And as you point out, I haven't actually given this a lot of thought until now, but it's an interesting question to see how it developed through time, because it wasn't a fluke, and it did involve a lot of different factors coming together to I mean, that even that Heritage Minute, right? It's Charles Bronfman who initially gives the money to Historica Canada to produce these heritage minutes. He thinks Canadians don't know enough about their history. He's right. And Charles Bronfman, probably the most patriotic Canadian Bronfman, he was the owner of the Expos. But the Bronfmans had been donors of Penfield's and acquaintances of Penfield's for decades. They helped build the original institute, with their, bootlegging money. So, yeah, it's just, Penfield was just an expert legacy builder with no value judgment placed on that designation. He had something, didn't come out of nowhere. He had an extraordinary story to tell, right? I mean, these are all the techniques and the advantages and the machinery of legacy building I'm talking about. But then there's the substance of the
Yeah,
legacy.
you need to have the substance. You have to have
You have
something
to
to
have the
build on.
substance. I mean, Penfield, he mapped the brain. It's not bad, right? And
Yeah.
and figured out essentially a cure for epilepsy. So, um, he has the substance. But yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, because Cohn had the substance too, and but none of the ancillary factors that burnish a legacy.
I mean, I'm here listening to you talk, and you have a lot of admiration for Penfield, but I could feel your heart being a little bit with Cone, in the sense of like a
Yeah.
forgotten character. Are you now looking at history and like looking for those forgotten characters? I mean, like, is this something that you're trying to right the wrongs of history, or like is this a bit of a crusade, like, or is no, but I could
No,
feel it in you, which is legitimate, correct? Like, you're like, hey, like, here's this guy worked hard, like, committed suicide, and like, and we don't remember him, and he's just as important as the other guys. So
yeah.
like, there must be thousands of people like that in the world
Yeah,
and in our history.
absolutely. No, I mean, it's another great question, and prompting me to think about things in a new way. Because not consciously, but now that and I don't really see myself as a natural crusader. I mean, as a journalist, as a newspaper reporter, we're not averse to crusades when we feel the cause is really just, but you got to be careful and restrain yourself and maintain balance. And these are all values that I've held dear throughout my career. My instinct is more to be intrigued by things, to be curious about things, rather than to be outraged by them. Although, if there's outrage to be felt, then, I can get there. But but finding an underdog and championing them, it's not my natural inclinations. There's something about Cone that reached out and grabbed me. Partly it's the cynical storyteller's instinct. I wanna, I've portrayed myself, and it is a genuine part of it as this champion of the underdog. Um, and partly, you don't spend 5 years on a project without it really resonating with you. But I also realized that there's a story to be told here, and that's you know, writers are lying to you if they don't acknowledge that you've got to see a way into the story. It's not just your heartstrings. Your sort of creative juices have to be activated too. And I realized that there's, the Penfield story has been told to some extent, and this is a compelling new angle on this saga of the mapping of the brain. Um, for both reasons, both for the sensitivity to the underdog and the um, cynical writerly reasons, I do now find myself looking for other stories like this because it was so rewarding to tell Cone's story, both as a creative project, which is fascinating, and I was just learning new things every day that no one else had ever come across, and also because I feel that I've done something good for this person lost to history. Um, and yeah, my next thing is Expo 67, which I've become obsessed with, another great Montreal story that also has forgotten characters and uh forgotten angles. Um, including this bank robber, Monica Preddy, female bank robbers robbed 20 banks the summer of Expo 67 and was this folk hero. She had dominated the headlines as much as Expo did that summer, but she hasn't been entirely forgotten in Montreal. There was a movie made about her, but I had never heard of her. And she was a sort of wretched of the earth that Jean Drapeau sometimes overlooked. So that's my next project.
That's the next one. I mean, it's interesting because we were talking about Penfield and we are talking about, I mean, we made a joke about Instagram, but two questions for me. One is, you're relatively young, and so you live in the zeitgeist of the time, but you were focusing on a historical character that built a legacy. I mean, it's not so like we're not talking about 500 years ago. So there was
Yeah.
media, there was whatever, but there wasn't the current kind of like media landscape. How do you think legacies will evolve or legacies will be built over time
Yeah.
in kind of like the new, I mean, we don't know what the future will look like, but we kind of know that it won't look like the past. So
Yeah.
how do you think people will think about their legacies or build their legacies from now on? Which leads me to my second question is, how are you now thinking about your legacy? Like after this
Yeah.
this this book, but the other things you're working on, is this kind of like backward looking and forward look, like how does that play into how you think about your own career?
Also, more more good questions. The 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 future of legacy building is so interesting. Someone asked me about this at a book event last week, actually, as a sort of craft question for historians. Penfield had this archive. It's ink and paper, and you go into a room And Penfield's archive is vast, but it is graspable. It's, I think 50 or 60 boxes of paper. Probably in a year I produce as much of a digital footprint as Penfield produced of, you know, ink and paper in the course of his career, right? And just how future historians are going to sift these digital archives that we keep, even the technical questions of how they're stored and transferred and what gets saved and lost. Um, in some ways, the problem will be that there will be too much. You don't want to spend 30 years on a single book. I mean, most people don't. It's not possible. And it's just I genuinely don't know, and I'm fascinated to talk to historians working about, people who've written the biography of people like Steve Jobs who lived in the digital era. You know, how many of the emails are you reading? Or the text messages or the social media posts. Like, um, there's things that are going to get lost, but then there's also the question of um,
What's relevant?
what's relevant. Yeah, how do you
Yeah.
sift through it all? Cohen in a way was a gift because I didn't have to make any of the hard decisions about what I would read and what I wouldn't. I read everything because there wasn't that much. Penfield, I had to do some triage. Okay, these years are really crucial to me. These years, not so much. But I can't wrap my head around it. I mean, it's hard enough already. It's just the amount of trivia that we, email and text about. It's going to be very difficult for future researchers. And yeah, I mean, maybe it's why I'm attracted to these relatively, ancient stories. The media that you're trying to sift through is more tangible in a way. It's newspaper archives, it's letters and carbon copies of letters, and it's physical diaries. And um, there is something. This is what prompted the question last week. There's something really exhilarating about being in a physical archive that I pity future researchers if they don't get to experience the musty smell of the paper and seeing the ink and the smudges and the crossing outs and God, you feel like those people are just hovering over your shoulder when you're reading through someone's diary. Who it's an incredibly intimate, powerful experience as a writer, and I think I couldn't have written the book without it because it makes you feel in contact with these people. So yeah, I mean, as as far as my legacy, I it is one of the attractions of writing a book, right? Is that it does last, or at least, can last longer than a newspaper article typically does. I think any author would be lying if they didn't say that was part of the appeal of this format. Um, I just got the first paperback of my book in the mail yesterday, and I like the idea that could, go yellow on someone's cottage bookshelf one day, and 30 years, someone, bored on a July afternoon might pull it down and with the spine all cracked, and that stuff is it's not bad for the sense of permanence that is otherwise quite hard to achieve in this in this life. Um, but um, but more than that, I want to keep writing books because I love the experience. I've written a book now, and so I'll be in the libraries. I'm not saying my book's gonna have can't say if it's gonna last, if it's gonna continue to be read, but um, I've kind of gotten the legacy part out of the way. I'm there. My name's on a hardcover somewhere. So from now on, I want to continue doing it because it's so exhilarating. It's such a big canvas, and if you're trying to challenge yourself as a creative person, you need to go for those big canvases. And I still love what I do at the Globe, and you know, painting more in miniature and at a faster pace. But but there's nothing like that the scope of a book, the kind of subjects you can take on are so different. And the level of detail you can get into is so much greater. Yeah, it's the I think, I'm not going to be the next Robert Caro. I don't think my legacy is is going to be etched in stone, but I still enjoy this. So stay tuned for Expo 67 and the bank robber. Um,
We'll look forward to it. We'll look forward to it. Thank you so much for being with us. It was really interesting, fascinating. We'll have you back.
yeah, thanks for having me. It was a really great conversation. And my book is out in paperback, The Mind Mappers, wherever fine books are sold.
Thank you.
ThinkBait, TNKR Media. Good talk.